thing that you actually mentioned earlier was how everything is interlinked, how the physical, the mental, all of them like are interlinked. And once we realize that, then the stigma around mental health could basically be removed, hopefully, because once you look at how the mental can affect your physical and your physical can also affect your mental, you get to a state where you realize that all of them are interlinked, equally as important. You can't have one without the other.
If you could mobilize a group of people, what movement would you mobilize and why?
I would call my movement the mindful movement. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death between people aged 15 and 29. 1 in 3 people are expected to suffer from mental illnesses in their lifetime. So I believe that mobilizing people to strive for mental health would actually fix so many social ills in our society, and that is what I would mobilize.
Being lethargic, irritability, and alienation, those are some of the symptoms of depression. There's a very thin line between normal teenage behavior and teen depression, and today we want to expand on that as it's Teen Suicide Prevention Week, and today we have a guest who is Elzette Fritz. So thankful that you could join us today to expand a bit on this topic.
Shudu, thank you very much for this opportunity. It is a very pertinent topic, specifically at this time. Depression with teenagers and adolescents at the best of times needs to be monitored very carefully. More so at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, because there's exacerbating circumstances which I think people need to be made aware of. So you're quite right when you gave the description in terms of affect. So typically adolescent teenage depression is known with an intensified experience of unhappiness, to the point where some will explain it to you and describe it to you as a black void, and they don't see the light, and it's completely alone. And with that is the irritability, which makes it different from adolescent depression, or sorry, adult depression. So often we only think it's just the low affect, but it's that irritability which we sometimes wrongfully identify as, oh, this is just a very difficult child, this is an oppositional child.
Or it's a phase.
Or it's a phase and it will pass.
It will pass.
Yes. We also understand that it's not just an emotional mood disorder, it influences the cognition as well, and the social interaction, and obviously the body. So often some of the signs that we identify with our youngsters is tired, more so than you would normally anticipate with an adolescent. A loss of interest. Their eating patterns can be disrupted. So either they can stop eating, they don't want to eat anymore, or it's accelerated eating. There's a loss of concern for anything, and often accompanied also with risky behavior. So those are some of the warning indicators that we need to be aware of.
So I think it's quite important to just speak on how you said it affects the physical body as well when you are struggling with depression. Can you expand a bit on that, please?
So we know that the physical, the emotional and the cognitive are all interlinked. You cannot separate the one from the other. So when we're thinking about physical, and we're thinking about extremely tired, lethargic, loss of concentration, which is more neurologically, literally doing the very basic things like getting dressed and going to school. So sometimes the adolescents will be referred because there's school avoidance. They don't want to go. Or there is disruptive behavior. Or there's headaches coming back to the body. Stomach aches. So sometimes you get those kind of patterns, or the self-injury, which starts alerting a person that there's a problem here. The risk is, however, for some of our adolescents, specifically our very high-functioning adolescents, who are extremely good at masking. So they're top achievers. On the surface, they seem to be coping, but they're internalizing all their feelings. those are often our ticking time bombs because no one expects it from them.
Is that who you may call the high-functioning depression?
That can be a high-functioning depression, yes.
Because it's very interesting that you also say that, because you call them ticking time bombs. Suicide is the third leading cause of death between people aged 15 and 19, which would make sense because you ask a person, or especially teens, how are you doing? And the answer is always I'm fine, even when it's not, because there's a feeling that you can't explain. It's like you're saying, it's almost like a dark hole. And especially now, like you're saying with COVID-19, everything has been exacerbated. Children are expected, or learners are rather expected to go to school, learn as if things are still how they were before, expected to still achieve the same things as they did before, which is something that we were discussing earlier. And how important is it? How can parents support kids without putting that much pressure on them? Because as a teen, I've been through a stage where you don't know what you want to do with your life, but you're also going through like a feeling that you can't explain. But then when you try to bring it up, it's almost like it can be either associated with religion or a phase like we were talking about. So how do parents get to a point, like once they identify that, how do they get to a point where they start helping their children instead of adding more pressure onto it, because we're losing a lot of teens?
So the first indicators is often you look at your child, you know your child best, you know the behavior patterns and personality. So yes, adolescence changes a little bit in terms of the personality, and often there's more intensified emotions. But any kind of big changes, you should start asking yourself, but what's going on here? So we know that some of those leading factors that start manifesting or triggering depression, there's a lot of studies that indicate that from a genetic point of view. So if a child comes from a family where there's a history in the family, mom, dad, uncles, aunts, biological family, that there's a prevalence of depression or any kind of mood disorders, also heightened anxiety, then the parents should already actually know. We need to keep an eye on our child, because there's a very strong possibility that it might start manifesting during our child's adolescent years. And if there's trauma, now we know from the adverse childhood experiences studies that the more trauma experiences a person had from a very young age, the more it puts you at risk of developing mood disorders. Add to that then something like COVID. And it becomes a mulberry effect. It just bubbles more and more and more, and it spirals out of control. So parents need to know themselves. They need to be honest. What kind of traits did I give my child possibly? What must I keep my eye open for? What is happening in the home environment? And we know that COVID-19, many families having to live under the same roof for an extended period of time. Some really liked their housemates, and others came out there thinking, this is not a safe place for me. And unfortunately, our children and our adolescents were exposed to what their emotional dynamics was in the family. So that is a contributing factor. And then a lot of the resiliency factors, last year and to a great extent still this year, is not in the picture. So the very things that would help an adolescent to continue suddenly went missing. So that social interconnectivity was suddenly not there.
And how important is that for teens and children in just general? Because I think that's another effect of COVID that most people might have overlooked. For many people, it's like, yeah, we're staying home, but for kids, like you're saying, they need that interconnectivity. So how important is it for teens and
I cannot emphasize that enough. For our children with anxiety and who are inclined to be introverts, for them not going to school, to an extent, was quite comfortable, provided the home environment was good and conducive. And the parental figures were not at loggerheads the whole time. So for them it was contained. Going back to school, however, suddenly exacerbates their anxiety and kicks in depression. But for the majority of our adolescents, because it is such a heightened social interaction phase, not being able to do that. And if I think about our older adolescents, so we're thinking about our grade 11s, our grade 12s, who were looking forward to socializing, end of the year breakaway. Suddenly that was not present anymore. So there's been a lot of talk last year about the adolescents breaking the curfew, suddenly just going to parties, not adhering to the COVID regulations. And there's a part of me that can very much understand why they didn't do that, because that is one of the main support buffers against falling into that very black hole of deep sense of isolation.
So just to expand on that, a lot of people ask, what is the difference between sadness and depression? How do you know that it's depression? Because you find that there's like a very thin line between normal teenage behavior, sadness, and depression. So how do we, I know you've told us the symptoms, but like what is the one key defining factor that separates sadness from depression?
It is the intensity of it. So sadness is, today I'm feeling a little bit blue. Tomorrow, a week from now, I'm up and going again. I can participate in my daily, every life activities. I can eat again. My appetite is still there. I engage with my friends. I don't withdraw completely. My mood isn't extremely spiky, so up and down and all over the place. So that is the difference. Sadness is, I'm a little bit blue, but I've still got hope. Whereas your depression they slip deeper into that black hole to a point where they actually become blunted and they stop caring. So nothing phases them.
Nothing.
Teacher can bomb on them, doesn't matter.
And that's when people just say, no, it's a phase, that's normal teenage behavior.
Yeah, it's an obstinate adolescent. So unfortunately what the adults then do, and many teachers, not all of them, many teachers then make the mistake of adding more pressure. So if I just send this child again to the principal, it's going to make a difference. And I'm now going to give an example of 2 principals that showed how you can deal with it differently. So a very, very obstinate adolescent that really pushed all the boundaries at school. Obviously, with a history, not just suddenly behavior out of the blue. And this child then one day just said, I'm not going to school anymore, just not going. Because if we rewind a little bit, the child had gone to school, had adhered, had tried his best, but then one teacher commented on a pants that was too tight. And that was the last straw for this child. So the child that just said, not going back anymore. And the 2 principals went to the child's house and they spoke to him. They didn't discipline him, didn't reprimand him. They met him on a very comfortable, safe space. And they communicated his importance. He went back to school. But those principals went beyond what normally is called for. And I think that is where teachers and parents, adults, need to be very sensitive. That a child, specifically with that irritability, there might be a story behind that. And be curious as to what is that story. Because you never know when you're adding the last straw.
So how do you, for teens, like you're talking about lockdown and how some people were forced to stay together. So if your trigger is a parent or even a teacher, how do you navigate that? Like how do you, in terms of teen depression, how do we deal with it? If the child's trigger, the teen's trigger is a parent or even someone of like a higher stature like a teacher, how do we deal with that?
What we now already know is that, specifically now referring to last year and this year with the pandemic, the majority of adults are highly activated. So a lot of them have heightened anxiety, which is then transferred directly onto the child. The majority of parents and teachers, I do believe, have the best interest of children at heart. So it comes to the point where you have to be, as an adult, quite aware of what are you experiencing, who is supporting you, and then be able to recognize what is the influence you have on a child. And I'm going to give another example now. In the last week, a child from high school grade 9, came to me. Now I work at a school, but I see people from other schools as well. So this child came to me in a state, and I sat her down and I said, okay, so just tell me what's going on. And she started talking very animatedly about what's going on. She identifies herself as being depressed. There's a history in the family of it. And what actually triggered her that morning was a conversation she had with a parent, where she felt the parent does not understand her, isn't listening what she is saying, had gone in on her phone, had identified a conversation, and this is a kid that normally follows the line. So it wasn't anything untoward, but the mom misunderstood the conversation. And this is just one example of how something quite small, it's not such a big thing, how it can compound. And suddenly the child just feels, no one understands me, I'm not loved, no one cares, I've got a history of cutting, maybe I must go back to that, or maybe just it's too much.
So how do you get treatment for that type of child? What treatment is available for teen depression? How do we treat it?
It's a systemic treatment, so we very seldom just do one thing. And once again, we have to look at the severity. So we know that the resiliency factors lie on the interpersonal level first and foremost. So we try and identify what kind of support structures are available within the family context. So what kind of support do the parents perhaps need? Caregivers. What kind of support is available in the community? So we know, and I can give you a long list of organizations, but I'm first going to start with the practical things. What is available within the school system? Is there a teacher that is kind, caring and compassionate that this child can talk to? Does this child have friends? Because we know that's one of the key factors very important for an adolescent is social connectivity. So we typically ask them, do you have friends? Can you talk to them? How do they treat you? Because if a child is disconnected from the social support network and you add bullying to the picture, everything becomes even worse. Is there a kind and caring adult that you can talk to? Once you've identified some of those indicators, you know, okay, what can we access? Knowing that I've now already said to you, most parents actually do want what's in the best interest of their child. But sometimes their resources are depleted, so they need help. We know the teachers themselves, they sometimes don't act very regulated at the moment because there's a high demand placed on them. So they need support as well. We find out from this child what normally gives you joy, pleasure. Is it art, music, singing, dancing, sport? Now once again, what COVID-19 caused, we took away sport, we took away other social interaction, joys and pleasures, music, dancing, festivals, concerts. So those are the kind of things we want to reinstate again. For some children it's an animal. They've got a cat or a dog, a rat, a snake, a something. So you identify what normally helps you. And based on the severity of symptoms, we get an idea, okay, do we need to refer you to a psychiatrist, or to a doctor, medical practitioner, someone that can assist on a medical level? Because maybe medication is going to be required. Is it the child herself or himself that needs support? Does the family need support? And what kind of an organization can render that support? Is there a life orientation teacher, or as I indicated, another teacher? Lifeline, Childline, SADAC, Department of Education, who do we phone? Those are the people that one can reach out to. So that we just can give that child the message, you're not alone.
And that's quite important.
That's actually the message they want to receive. I'm not alone in this, and I'm not being judged.
And it's okay to not be okay. I think that's one thing that, like, as a teen, you'd want to hear. It's okay to not be okay. You're not alone. And I think maybe that's the importance of just like everyone that you mentioned. From what you were saying, it's a community effort. to get healing. Because if you just take care of the child, but everything else around them is still the same, then you're just basically not doing much. So it's quite important to engage everyone, the community, the parents, the teachers, even calling the Department of Education, SADC, all of them, because there's so many resources available for children to get help, for teens to get help, but no one really directs them towards that. It's almost like, again, everyone thinks it's a phase, this and this and that. But I think it's quite important to treat it early, because from what I was reading, it can be a feeling that people get used to. So they don't get to a point where for them there's no healing. This is how they're supposed to feel. Any sort of joy will make them feel as if, no, this is not the normal feeling that I'm supposed to be feeling. So they get accustomed to feeling depressed.
Yes. And there's only so long you can find yourself in an experience, because it's very much a physical experience of sitting in that dark corner or in that dark hole, and there's no light and there's no hope. So ultimately what we try and do is to give them hope and to tell them that you're not alone in this. It will pass, but you don't have to face it alone. So to give this child that came to me the message, okay, who's there for you, who listens, who can you talk to, what do you aspire to, what do you like? And I'm here, and your friends are there, and who else can you talk to at school? And what I often do is I'll explain to the adolescents, but remember, your parents, your caregivers also have a story. You might not be aware of their story. And so you think it's you, whilst in actual fact, it's not you. What they did and what they said might actually have very little to do with you. They're struggling with their own demons.
Which is something that I always say, even with bullying, when people bully you or treat you in a certain way, it's a reflection of them, not a reflection of you. Don't take it personally, but if you're in that space where you're going through so much, it's difficult to not take it personally. I once went to a friend and said, listen, I'm struggling. I need help. I never spoke to anyone about how I was feeling. So I went to this one friend of mine and I was like, okay, I'm struggling with 1, 2, 3, and I don't think I'm okay. I need help. She basically told me that I don't want to be friends with someone that feels like that because you're bad for my energy. So at that time when it happened, I just further isolated myself. So as a friend, I always wondered, what expectation did I have of her? How was she supposed to respond? As a friend, how do you respond to someone that's going through like a mental health illness or even depression? How do you respond to that?
That is the challenge, because adolescence is a very self-centered phase, where it's actually all about me, myself and I. And that's age appropriate. So it's sometimes very difficult for a friend to give support, specifically if they come from a family where there's been judgment about mental illness, mental health, wellness that's not 100% functioning. And that carries over into the school environment. So for me, what's quite imperative is life orientation is a subject where these kind of topics should actually be unpacked. They should be discussed. They should be given to children to come up also with what kind of solutions, how do I identify it, and not hide it away. Make it more socially acceptable to discuss and to learn, but what can I do about it? Because the chances are very good. Your friend today, if we were to talk to her now, and she were to look back at them, she might have a totally different view. And she might then realize, woof, that was harsh. How she acted.
And at that time, you need, speaking out is one of the biggest steps.
Yes.
So when you speak out, it's almost like that one moment could change a person's life forever.
Yes.
Depending on who's listening. So it's quite important to know as a friend or even as a parent how to speak to someone like that. Where if they're struggling, you don't dismiss them. You don't tell them then, okay, no. Because the biggest thing is, I was watching this video that talked about how once we start viewing depression as a disease and not a weakness, there's a big change that can come about in how we respond to it.
Yes.
There's a big change.
Yeah. I often say to parents and to teachers, the challenge with adolescence is you have to love that child when they're at their worst. And that's easier said than done. And I think specifically in the context of schools and teachers and parents, caregivers who are really struggling to cope. And now you're faced with a child that's showing you their darkest shadow. How do you still like and love them? And that's actually what is required, is to look beyond the symptom behavior. Because when a child is depressed, they tend to push people away. Because there's a part of them that has a little bit of self-loathing and that gets stuck in that dark corner, doesn't want to be seen. So they push people away. And it's then a challenge to still move towards them and to hold them very gently. And the mistake that many grown-ups make is they want to add more pressure. They want to make the rules stricter. They want to hold tighter. And the more you do that, the more you're placing the child at risk. So for a child with an adolescent with depression, and often it's comorbid with anxiety, you actually have to hold them very gently and lightly and decide what's really important. Is the homework not done today important? Or am I looking beyond that? And if I know your story, how do I rather keep that in mind and realize, yeah, the homework's important, but it's not the be-all and the end-all, specifically at this moment.
Because I think there's so many pressures on teens right now, learners right now. Like I said earlier, you're still expected to perform at the best that you would have prior to the pandemic. But I always speak about small victories and always focusing on the small victories, like you're saying. Some days it's just about getting that maths homework done. I'm not saying school is very important, but we also need to just check in on the mental health of students, just making sure that they're okay. Because in as much as parents can have expectations of the teens, they have expectations of themselves. They don't even know what they're going to be doing in the next 5 years.
A lot of the adolescents recently have said to me, school at this stage is not that important for them because they've been looking forward to the end of school for so long. And suddenly, the whole world is in chaos. So they're questioning, where are they going? Is it worthwhile? Is it sustainable? Do they still want to go to university? Universities only now are starting to open some of their doors. So for many of them, that brought a question mark. And some of them are now going and rushing into risky kind of behavior because life is short. They witnessed it. They've lost parents, family members. So that idea of I'm going to have a long, fruitful life, I'm going to be a millionaire when I'm 30, suddenly is actually not that important anymore because I might not be alive anymore.
So as an educational psychologist, how do you encourage that child to stay in school? How do you encourage them to just... How do you encourage that child? Like, how do we move forward with them?
The answer comes from the adolescents who tell me they go to school because that's where the other kids are. And remember, they want the social connectivity.
The social connectivity.
And to listen very carefully, but what does give them joy and pleasure? So often I will ask parents and caregivers, what did your child enjoy most when they were very young? Because that's an indicator. And maybe we need to support them in that. And alternative thinking and revise our own vision for our children in terms of you need to go to university, you need to get a degree in order to get a qualification, in order to get a job. Now we've realized with COVID and lockdown, the entrepreneurs, some of them were able to continue. And suddenly they saw opportunities and they went with it. So to listen what your child is telling you with an open mind and not with a fixed mindset. And to remember, one of the best antidotes for depression is still laughter. So to see what brings joy in a general day. Our risk factors are some of the very things that can also bring joy, and that's the technology. And we haven't even touched on that. For a large part of our population, last year and this year, they had to rely on technology. The majority of our population didn't have that privilege. So they couldn't study. So that added another kind of anxiety. So that poses challenges for teachers, education systems. How are we going to address that? And allow our children to still continue with a gap and giving them a hope for a future that at the moment is very unsure. And that poses a challenge for the creative thinking of the adults.
And what do you tell that teen who needs to go on medication? How do they know that nothing is wrong with them? That it's okay to take medication, it's okay to do, because I think one thing about wanting to take medication is also that thing in your mind that you are actively admitting that there's something wrong. And once you do that, that means it's there. You can't ignore it anymore. Where you spent, like you said, we spoke about earlier, masking it. Now you have a psychiatrist telling you that you need to take antidepressants. What do you tell that teen who's going through that it's okay? Like,
I start by telling them that you are not just a heart and not just a brain and not just guts. You're all of them linked in between. So there's no difference with someone that's got diabetes and needs insulin. I need spectacles. Someone else needs blood pressure tablets. What makes it so much different then? To take something that helps the hormones and the neurological functioning in your body, if it's going to help you function better. Because we know that the rapid brain change and the hormonal secretion, along with the exploration of sexual identity, all of those factors play a role during adolescence, with the whole brain that's rewiring. So it's not a case of one morning I wake up and I decide I'm going to be depressed. No person in their right mind chooses that card. So we do everything we can, just like if I had a kidney problem, heart problem, I would take my medication.
So I think one thing that you actually mentioned earlier was how everything is interlinked, how the physical, the mental, all of them are interlinked. And once we realize that, then the stigma around mental health could basically be removed, hopefully, because once you look at how the mental can affect your physical and your physical can also affect your mental, you get to a state where you realize that all of them are interlinked, equally as important. You can't have one without the other. And it's quite important for us to, especially like you were saying, in a subject like life orientation, for that to be communicated. Because I think one thing that's important is that in the school curriculum, we need to get to a point where we speak about mental health and actually normalize it. Because most people can't have that conversation until they come to you. But when they go back to class, they could be coming to you crying, and then they go back to class and then they have to smile. And that's the reality of so many people. And I'm thinking about now with the matric results coming out. Last year was not an easy year, but the matrics are still expected to bring out amazing results, exceptional results. But then they're just thinking about how I was just focusing on trying to survive. I probably lost a loved one from COVID-19, but I'm still expected to get an 80%. What do you say to those matrics that are waiting for the results with anxiety on the results coming out on, you said Friday? Yes.
I say to the adults first and foremost.
Adults, okay.
The parents and the caregivers and the teachers. I say, please keep all those factors in mind. Your child is way more important than the marks. They can rewrite. And even if some of them have to redo a whole year, in the general lifespan of a person, that's not the end of the world. So I tell that first and foremost to the adults. And then I will tell to the children. The fact that you made it down to the end of the year is amazing. So let's look at what your marks say and what can you do with it. And if they're not as good as you had wanted them to be, let's see, where do you want to go? And do you really need some of those scores in your mind that you think you need? And sometimes we need to take a bit of a detour in life. We don't know why, but maybe we do, to take us somewhere else.
Which is true, because with me, which is going to lead to my next question as to how matrics can cope with disappointing results or perhaps even failing. With me in matric, I struggled a lot with anxiety, to the point where if I'm studying, I start crying because my hand will start shaking because the fear of failing was just way too much. I remember the night before my mathematics paper 2 exam, I was crying and laughing at the same time because it was just the weirdest episode I've ever had. And I was still expected to go to school the next day, and I'm just thinking about how if I don't get the right marks, I'm not going to get into university. I'm still waiting to be accepted. And then eventually it got to me to the point where in matric, I stopped studying. I was like, what's the use? My brain is not like getting the information, and there's nothing I can do. I'm constantly anxious. So what's the use? And I remember I wrote my science exam without even studying. I don't even know how I passed, but then it was so difficult for me to get into the courses that I wanted. So we had to sit down with my mom and just start thinking about what the alternatives are. Yeah. And that's what people don't present to matrics and teens in general, the fact that there's always alternatives. Yes. My mom was like, it's fine, you can take your gap year, but if this is what you want to study, go somewhere where you can upgrade your marks and actually get into the course that you want. Yeah. I did that. I had to humble myself completely, because there's this notion that if you do that, you're a failure. At home, back home, people are already thinking that I failed or I did this, where in actual fact, I was just happy that I made it out of matric alive. Yeah. I didn't think I would be able to. I was just happy that I made it out alive. And when I upgraded, I ended up getting into university. I worked hard to get into the course that I wanted. But then if I think back at how, when that happened, I didn't get the marks that I wanted, if I gave up then and I didn't have the right support system, I wouldn't be where I am today. And it's important to let matrics and teens know that there are other like alternatives. So to those, what your advice can be, like to matrics who are coping, who have to cope with disappointing results, or perhaps even failing, what advice would you give to them?
I would say to them, go and look at what are the other options. There are possibilities for rewriting, so consider that if you want to upgrade. Look at other courses. Because maybe you wanted to go and study medicine, for example, where we know the grades have to be very high. Maybe you can't go in there immediately. What other courses that's still of interest to you? So when I do, for example, subject choice and career guidance, I will always tell them, you need 3 options in life, because there could be a roadblock. And then you need to know what you're going to do about it. And look at your other passions and skills and how can you use that.
And there's so many options. There's so many options. And when you get into university, you can work hard towards what you want. When I got in for something that I didn't intend on studying, but I told myself that there's always another alternative. So I worked really, really hard and changed to get to where I wanted to. But like I said, if we don't tell our matrics this, because most of the time when you fail matric, your life is over.
Yeah, it's like the end of the world.
That's what people tell you. But then the fact that there's rewriting, upgrading, and just basically other career choices that you can take, or other avenues that you can take.
There's diploma courses.
But then we're so programmed in our minds to think that no, it has to be this, it has to be that. And these pressures are actually contributing to teen depression.
Yeah. Because the expectations are so big and the disappointment so devastating. And more so if the pressure from the caregiving home is unrealistic and there's not consideration for what's been happening worldwide.
So I got a few questions from our followers, and most of the questions are just generally about depression. So one question that they have is, what role does bullying play in depression?
Plays a very big role because it breaks the interpersonal connectivity and you're ostracized, so you get that sense of shame. So that is one topic that schools need to be very aware of. Also realizing that those children who are the bullies
also have a problem.
Most probably have a trauma story. So how do we support them so that it does not become a perpetuating problem? And how do we support the one that is being bullied and the bully? Because both need to be supported.
Because that's what I had to realize, because I was bullied for 6 years. I had to realize that in as much as I was the one being bullied, the person that was bullying me also had a problem. And once you realize that they are projecting what they're feeling onto you, then it becomes a completely different story. But there are lifelong repercussions to bullying, which include depression.
Yes.
And another question is that, how do you help a parent deal with depression?
Firstly, I would help the parent by giving them the message that there's no shame in it, and it does not necessarily reflect on them as parents. So it's not a case of, I failed as a parent, therefore my child has depression. Because with that comes guilt and shame. So take those feelings out of the picture.
Because parents do make it personal. When a child is suffering from depression, it becomes a reflection of how they did as a parent more than the child's actual illness.
That's a hard lesson.
It's a hard lesson to say that it's not about you. I'm struggling, but it's not about you. So what would you, as a final message, what would you tell teens that are struggling with depression right now? Even those that don't know that they're struggling with teen depression, but they know that they're in this dark tunnel, they're in this dark place and they can't get out of it. And like, what would you tell them?
I'm going to say, if Shudu could go through 6 years of bullying and the kind of anxiety that went with matric and end up where she ended up, there's hope. And ultimately it lies with communication. So talk to someone, anyone, and keep on talking until someone hears you.
Keep on talking until someone hears you.
Yeah.
Part of me feels like that was a message that I would have wanted to hear when I was in high school. Keep on talking until someone hears you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think one thing that I'd also want to ask you is why you think Teen Suicide Prevention Week is important.
Because the social media plays such a big role in the lives of our children and adolescents. And so this makes them aware that there are other people, that there are people who care, that there are avenues that can render help.
And ultimately, you're not alone.
Yes.
And once you realize that you're not alone, it's easier for us to engage in these conversations and for you to be receptive towards it. Thank you so much for this conversation. It helped me a lot because these are some of the things that I had questions about, and especially as someone that had gone through bullying and anxiety in high school, it was quite an important topic for me to engage with you in. And thank you so much for the messages that you imparted today.
Thank you for you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for watching.